Thank you so much for attending. This is quite amazing. We didn't expect this many people to be here tonight, so I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the City Plan team. We've had an exciting panel discussion here tonight. This is the future of transit, so if you're expecting us to discuss something else, well, you might be in the wrong room. So with that, what I'd like to talk about first is start with a question, and that is, we're really going through a lot of change right now, transportation revolutions, and it's going to transform the way we travel into the future. And so I think we're all feeling the sense of massive changes, whether it be by technology or demographics, more people moving into the community, or simply just the pace of life. It's kind of, for me, it's kind of like a Snapchat takeover of our lives. It feels like that sometimes. So this effect profoundly affects public transportation and mobility. So we hope tonight to get a little bit more information about those changes and the way the community can adapt to those changes. So what I'd like to do first is acknowledge Mayor Troxel, who's going to say a few words tonight to kick us off. I'd also like to acknowledge any other council members. I didn't see any others that are in the room. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I forgot that part. My name's Timothy Wilder. I'm the transit planning manager for the city. We also have other city members in the audience. I'm not going to introduce all of them, but just know that we're here to help and to answer your questions tonight. Also like to acknowledge Jeff Mihalik, who's the deputy city manager, is also in the audience. Jeff, do you want to wave? Okay, so he's here as well. Thank you for attending. So with that, I'm going to jump right into it and ask the mayor to come up.
Thank you all, and thank you for Timothy and everybody in our FC Moves organization, and really addressing this important opportunity I think that we have before us. You know, I think back Fort Collins has always been an innovation community. So we were the smallest community that had a full transit system from 1907 to 1952. And then we had progress, and we took that away, and really became more car-centric, right? And really what we're trying to do is reimagine the future, building on our past in so many ways. And, you know, that's really at the core of what we have here in Fort Collins is this notion of really thinking about the future, being aspirational, being visionary, but also being very much grounded in the present and how do we actually affect that future. And that's what we're doing here tonight. I want to thank the panelists for being here and the moderator and all of you for really adding to the discussion. What makes Fort Collins special to me is really everyone in our community is engaged. Everyone in our community is a co-creator to make it a better community. And just you being here and having your thoughts and expressing your ideas and having a conversation around this topic is important to all of us and important to the future. We talk about Fort Collins being an innovation community, and we have great examples of that. We're recently recognized by Bloomberg Philanthropies for the U.S. Mayor's Challenge for an idea that actually is providing $1 million to help us implement on-bill financing for low to moderate income housing to help us achieve our climate action goals. And it's a model that actually provides for financing and bringing together private sector financing for on-bill financing to underwrite the cost for some of the underwriters to provide the ability for pre-screened contractors and things like that, but it will help us in terms of our housing stock become more energy efficient as well as better air quality. And these are just the things. We talk about, we've got $10 challenges within our community and we have $1. So how can we be creative, innovative, to bring public-private partnerships together to help invest in our future for the betterment of our community? And that's just one example. You know, we're also featured in the Smithsonian, Place of Invention, for the 2010s going forward. The other 5 cities as part of the exhibit are in the past, talking about Silicon Valley in the 1960s around technology, or Bronx in the 1990s around hip-hop and how that's transformed the music industry, or around Hollywood in the 1930s around how technology created innovation in the movie industry. And then Fort Collins is featured in the 2010s around renewable energy and how we come together as a community to provide solutions for the future. It talks about the Energy Institute and our partnership with Colorado State University in so many ways that help us to address the future related to energy and energy innovation. We talk about another example is we're a platinum city. We're the most bike-friendly city in the United States. And that's a remarkable thing where we're building infrastructure that actually helps make our community more safe, as well as we build out these multi-modes of transportation systems that allow us to actually have more options for all of us to have, I think, ultimately get to greater livability for our community in so many ways in the future. So it's in that spirit that we are addressing transportation. We talk about we're a city as a platform for innovation, and an analogy is actually using transportation. We build roads so businesses can locate along roads, so citizens can get to businesses and have commerce within our community, and so the roads becomes the network for commerce. Well, if you extend that analogy more broadly to city as a platform, we can do that in so many ways. We're a platform for innovation to convene, to bring together ideas that help to create solutions, not only for Fort Collins, but other places around the United States and around the world. So there's so many things that we have in place today that we can build upon, and now we bring it to this opportunity tonight to talk about our transit systems. I think transportation in general will see a profound transformation over the next 20, 30 years. As a council, we talk about that when we talked about financing a parking garage. What is a parking garage going to be in 20 years? Maybe irrelevant, maybe a staging area for autonomous vehicles, maybe a lot of other things other than a parking garage for cars. And so when you begin to think about that, it begins to conjure up a lot of ideas. When you begin to think about autonomous vehicles, but you also start thinking about microtransit, things that are more contextually based on campuses or retirement village areas and things like that. When we start to think about how technology allows for ride sharing and other kinds of sharing of assets, it begins to transform where it doesn't always have to be public sector dollars, but it can be in leveraging assets that actually provides for more livable and mobility in our community. So thinking in those sorts of things and thinking in terms of how travel can become more of a strategic way to how do we accomplish the more livable community for the future. So I think it's an exciting time in so many ways. And I haven't even mentioned, mentioned things on the ground, but we haven't even talked about things in the air with drones. So I'm on the Drone Advisory Committee that helps advises the FAA on rulemaking related to drones. And you think about there's companies that sit on that advisory committee that talk about drone ports having 50,000 takeoffs and landings in a drone port in a day. And that would be a locally located drone port. So when you think about delivery systems, carrier services, when you think about health care, there's another company that sits on that drone advisory committee that's already documented 140 saved lives by use of drones because of delivery of blood in a timely way or other sorts of things. So we're really at the cusp of a lot of change as it relates to transportation systems. And tonight, this is built into our city plan and about our transit plan and where things are going. So I'm excited to be here, and I thank all of you for being here, and look forward to the conversation that we're going to have here tonight. And Timothy, thank you so much for and the rest of the team for setting this up. Anyway, let's have a great conversation tonight. Thank you.
Okay, so this isn't just about us conveying information to you. We have some engaging activities, and we're going to start with one here in a minute. You all should have the little white rectangular boxes, and these are clickers. And so what we're going to do throughout tonight's presentation is share a couple questions and get your responses to those. So your last entry counts. So you can put in other entries, but your last one counts. I typically say go with your gut. Whatever your gut say. The first answer is usually the right one, right? Okay, so the first question we had to warm you up a little bit is, what year did Transfort begin service? All right. Okay, so most people said 1974. Correct answer is 1974. Good job. All right. Good job. Okay, continuing on. Our first year of service was in 1974. How many trips did Transfort carry that first year? So you have your choices here: 35,000, 65,000, 73, or 88,000. 3, 2, 1, here we go. All right, 35,000 was top. Okay, what's the real answer? 73,000. Wow. And I'm told this was a partial year, so it probably was higher, but I don't have that number. Okay, now in 2017, so last year, how many trips did we carry in 2017? Okay, wow, we got some pretty smart people here. The answer is 4.3 million. That was last year. And we're on track right now to break that. We're probably around 4.5 million now. So, and just to give you some perspective, unfortunately we don't have the 2017 number in here. It's 4.3. But this is the growth of Transfort from 2000. So we've grown quite rapidly. And you can see from 2013 when that was a year prior to MAX, and then 2014 when we brought in the MAX Bus Rapid Transit service, we've really been growing a lot, and that's continuing to today. Okay, so that hopefully gives you a little warm-up. Now, just to talk a little bit about tonight's agenda, I'm going to give a really brief background on the purpose for the event, the context of city plan, that effort. We're going to do a few clicker polling during the presentation, and then I'm going to hand it over to our moderator to introduce the panel. We're going to spend most of the time with the panelists answering questions. We're going to do some more clicker. Then you're going to have a chance to ask questions at that time, and then we'll wrap it up. We'll try to get you out of here by 8 if we can. Okay, just a few ground rules. We're taking questions on the subject of tonight's discussion. We're not going to take questions about Transfort operations and other issues you might have. If you do have those, please save those questions and ask us after the event. And then be respectful tonight, and I think we can all do that. So thank you. Okay, so just to start it off, we are in the midst of a planning effort that is updating the city's comprehensive plan called City Plan. And maybe many of you have attended those events, very well attended. We're getting great feedback from you and the rest of the community on the direction the city should head in the next 20 years. As one of these efforts, it's combined 3-way plans. One of these is the Transit Master Plan. And so in this effort, we're really honing down into the needs for updating that Transit Master Plan. So these are all integrated. We're doing them together, and this is the big event to talk about transit. Within this process, we've had 6 to 8 months worth of work, a lot of engagement at different levels. Right now we're in what's called the scenario development stage. We're starting to hone in on one preferred scenario, one recommendation as part of this planning effort. And so I'm going to share with you in a moment what that looks like right now for transit. That could be evolving depending upon the kind of feedback we get. We will be moving eventually next year into a draft plan. So I hope you can participate in this broader process and give your feedback if you haven't already. Okay, so as part of the Transit Master Plan, we've been trying to better align our land uses, commercial corridors, neighborhoods, and other areas with the right type of transit service. And so this chart shows you the idea that we have that not every area is appropriate for every kind of transit service. So in some areas where we have a lot of density, a lot of people that could ride a transit system, we are talking about things like bus rapid transit. We're talking about high frequency bus service. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we're talking about, in low density areas, we're talking about maybe there are other ways to have people travel around the community. So in this example, it would be like microtransit. We've talked about Uber and Lyft, those kinds of services where it's really hard to get a bus into those neighborhoods. So it's a range of different types of services. And mostly tonight, we're going to be honing in on these lower levels. We'll talk a little bit about our fixed route network, our bus network, but mostly about where there are opportunities for these different types of services. And this will kind of, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but we can come back to this if there are questions. Okay, so land use. This map shows you where the current ideas of where different land uses are appropriate. So the red are more commercial areas. We're focusing on densifying commercial corridors. We're talking about transit-oriented development, which are areas that support transit. Also, another big issue, we've heard from the community that two big issues that have come up is housing affordability and transportation. Those are the two top issues we're hearing about. So housing affordability, we're obviously not dealing with tonight, but it is a big issue. We hope to hear more from the community, and we're working on possible solutions to that issue. So that's the land use. Yellow, blue areas are single-family neighborhoods. Orange is multifamily. Keep in mind this map, because we're going to be referring to this concept later on. Okay, transit network. So what we do is we take that underlying land use and we put on top of that a transit network. We talk about different transit networks, what should be included in those networks, how much bus service, are there other services that are appropriate. This is the latest concept that we have. It is showing, BRT means bus rapid transit. That is the max bus rapid transit service that you see today, the big green buses. We're talking about that, expanding that network to North College, West Elizabeth, and Harmony Road. We believe the land uses that are planned can support that level of transit service. We're also talking about a high-frequency network, so that's the lower level, that is buses coming every, say, 10 or 15 minutes, and Drake and CSU. This map also shows other less frequent routes, and it shows these areas that are sort of highlighted in this blue color. Okay, so just zooming in a little bit on that map, we have two concepts here that we want to further elaborate. One is, I'm going to start with the innovation zones. These are these darker blue areas, and these are areas that I described as harder to serve with bus transit. Harder to get buses in, maybe there's not a good place to turn around, maybe there are not enough people to ride the bus to make it efficient, to make it cost effective. So we're talking about, these are areas where we can innovate the kind of mobility. This is areas where maybe on-demand, maybe microtransit, what we'll hear about tonight, are appropriate. Okay, non-traditional, we're calling non-traditional transit options. This other concept is, how do we get people into the bus system? And this is the concept of a mobility hub, where we find an area where we can marry together different ways of traveling, bikes, peds, on-demand services, park and rides, information systems, curb space for people who want to get dropped off, those kinds of things into an area, and they can get onto the bus system if they want to get onto that system. Okay, so those are two key concepts. Okay, so that is my very brief overview of where we're at today in this process. For more information, I strongly encourage you to sign up to learn more about the process. There's a sign-up sheet on the city's webpage. I know this is a lot to type in, but ourcity.fcgov.com, city plan. So go into that site, sign up. We will have information about these concepts here tonight. And there's also a way to ask questions or make comments on that site as well. So I realize we can't cover everything tonight, but if you want more information or if you want to add your thoughts, go to the site. If you want to find out about future events, go to the site. Okay. All right, so with that, I believe we have the next clicker question. So again, we're still in sort of the warm-up phase. How often do you ride Transfort? So be honest. Okay, 3, 2, 1. And there's no right answer here, so I should have said that. Most people rarely. Okay, and there's probably a good reason for that, right? So here's the distribution, all right? Okay, next question is, and this is related to the last one, how do you perceive public transportation, Transfort in particular, in Fort Collins? Does it go where I want and when I want? So is it the service I need? Does it go where I want but not when I want? So maybe you have a bus, but it doesn't come often enough. It goes when I want, so it's frequent, but it's not where I need it to go. And then finally, does it not go where nor when I want? So it doesn't really serve my needs at all. All right, so most people say where I want but not when I want. So for us, we look at that, that's frequency. That's how often does the bus come? Does it come frequent enough? And many of you said, it doesn't really go where I want it or when I want it. Okay, thank you. Good information. Okay, so next, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Ann Bowers, who is part of our consulting firm, Fair & Peers, and she's going to start the next portion of our discussion. Thank you.
As Timothy said, my name is Ann Bowers, and I am a transportation engineer with Fair & Peers. We are transportation consultants, and I'm located in our Denver office. The reason I'm here tonight is, again, as Timothy said, I'm part of the consulting team that's helping the city on the city plan project, and I am managing the transportation master plan aspect of it. So that's a little bit about myself, and I would like to just start out. We have quite the distinguished panel here, and if they'll just take a couple seconds and introduce themselves, and then we'll go into some questions for them. Chris?
So I'll start. My name is Chris Brayland. I was told to not eat the mic, so I'll try to refrain from doing that up here. I am a principal with Fair & Peers. I'm in our Seattle office, and I'm one of our transit practice leaders in the company. And I'm working on the transit master plan here with Transfort and working with Ann as we're integrating transit and transportation together.
And I'm Jeff Slater. I'm a principal with Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates. We're a transportation planning firm, and I'm one of the leads of our transit practice. And I'm out of our Boston office. Chris and I both came from a ways for this.
Hi, my name is Mark Shearer. I'm with Chariot, which is a division of Ford Smart Mobility, which is a further division of Ford Motor Company. For those of you who are maybe not familiar with microtransit, it is a relatively new term. It kind of fits in between the private sector, individual vehicles, or taxi cabs. Just cutting me off. To mass transit. So it kind of fits in between those two areas. So me being from this area, I just want to compliment Transfort on the amazing initiatives that they've taken over these years. The transformations, every time I come up here, I'm blown away. So you guys have done a fantastic job along with Colorado State University. I'm just blown away by the options. I graduated in 2007. I see that you guys have doubled ridership since 2007 from 2 million to 4.3. So that's awesome. I love seeing this. So happy to be here.
Hey everyone, I'm Lauren Isaac. I'm with Easy Mile. We are a driverless technology company. The company's based in Thank you. The company's based in France, but we actually chose to have our North America headquarters in Denver. So we are neighbors, and I'm excited to share more about that. And just to give you an idea, I have a background doing consulting for transit agencies, and I also worked for a bike share company. And then that led me to autonomous technology. So I kind of have followed the trends in the transportation space. So I look forward to the discussion.
My name is Brittany Cameron. I'm an operations manager with Lyft. So I run daily operations for the Lyft app in the state of Colorado. I'm very excited to be here tonight. I was actually the one that set up the original footprint here in Fort Collins when we launched just over 2 years ago.
Great. Thank you, panel members. And as Timothy said, we have some questions that are specific to the panel here, and then when we're finished with that, we'll open up to Q&A to the audience to ask the panel members your questions. So I'm going to start off, and Chris, you have the first question. Describe how you see public transportation changing in response to customer mobility needs and disruptive new technologies.
So I'd want to just echo what Timothy said sort of at the start of this piece, is that right now it's a really dynamic time in transportation with a lot of new technologies coming on board. They're changing all the time, and your mayor mentioned everything from drones to autonomous vehicles. But I want you to couple that with a lot of just more fundamental basic changes that are equally transformative, but not always given as much credence in terms of how people will change their mobility patterns, but are equally important. Things like, especially here in Fort Collins, we have an aging population. That's true nationwide, but it's also true here in the city, and that changes how people move around. Can you independently drive or bike around the way that you used to? The aging is just a natural process that affects how people move around. We have changing fundamental sort of travel patterns related to not specifically transportation technology, but other things going on, particularly related to things like e-commerce, things like telemedicine, telework, things that you don't have to travel as much for those types of needs, but the research has generally shown out that people don't necessarily stop traveling, they just travel for other reasons once they have some of the other needs taken care of them for them. That puts different travel patterns out there on the system, and Transfort, as an agency that accommodates travel patterns, all transit agencies need to be aware of how those patterns are going to be affecting their customers in the future. And then related to just the city changing as a whole, Timothy put up a map. The city, all cities change. Cities are changing places. Fort Collins is a desirable place to live. It's been growing over the years. That will continue. And the city plan effort is really in a way to help to organize how that growth occurs. And as more people come here, and as particularly the city is growing in a more dense pattern, that's going to change the types of trips that people make and how people choose to make those. So all those changes taken together, along with some of these disruptive trends, as we call them in the transportation industry, things like autonomous vehicles, things like additional sort of unified payment systems or cashless payment systems where all the funds are funneled through a more simple source. Those are all affecting how transit agencies need to be thinking about adapting to those different types of changes in both the technology and people's mobility patterns. I just want to give sort of three sort of in a short burst kind of things that I think transit agencies are going to need to do to adapt, and then sort of elaborate just on a couple of those pieces. But first is, I think the successful transit agencies are going to be focusing on the areas of their strengths, where transit is generally going to always perform well. And that has to go back to just kind of space and physics. If you're trying to move a lot of people in as little space as you can, because there's only so much road space, there's only so much curb space, there's only so much parking space, larger vehicles are fundamentally more efficient at doing that than smaller vehicles. So therefore, what we call trunk transit lines aren't really going to go anywhere. They're important. There's no better way to move people in that form. So transit agencies are likely going to adapt to really kind of double down on those types of services. But at the same point, I expect a lot of transit agencies, and some are already starting to do this, to shed services that are just not as well suited to driving a 40-foot bus around to pick up a handful of people. So those sorts of changes will change how the service is actually provided by the transit agency. But one thing that the private sector is doing right now that I think is some transit agencies are adapting to well and others are not, and this is going to accelerate over time, is just transit agencies, the successful ones, are going to have to up their game on technology. People just have a more expectation in terms of what information they get and how they consume that information about mobility, and specifically transit mobility. And, you know, like it or not, our great friends at Uber, Lyft, and Chariot set a very high bar that I think transit agencies are going to need to help to match over time, so that people get a fairly consistent and high quality sort of customer service regardless what mode they take. So that's what I want us to sort of put in on that.
I would say the four major kind of trends that we're seeing right now in transportation would be with the acronym ACEs. So it's autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And you see that amongst all of like our technology companies here. But autonomy, introducing the driverless technology. Connected is the ability for vehicles to talk to other vehicles, or vehicles to talk to infrastructure, or people to be able to communicate with these. Electric, so electric vehicles, we're seeing a really growing increase in both the infrastructure needed as well as the vehicles that are getting equipped with electric technology. And then finally, shared, the opportunities that are created by sharing vehicles, sharing houses with Airbnb, sharing everything, bikes. We're seeing it across the board. So I would say those four end up being kind of the major themes that underlie a lot of what we're seeing now for transportation.
I think one thing I can add on how things are changing, I think with Lyft and Uber and other alternatives, one of the benefits they have is they're a lot more convenient than transit. You know, a Lyft vehicle is going to come a lot quicker than your bus often will. And that is changing the way that transit systems are thinking about things. And the concept of frequency is becoming much more important. And I think the answers you provided, you know, Transfort goes where you want, but not when you want it to. And a lot of that is because the service isn't frequent. So within the transit industry, there's now a much greater focus on providing more frequent services, sometimes making the trade-off. We're not going to serve as many places, but the places we do serve, we're going to provide much more convenient service.
What types of shared mobility are available now, and where have they been successful? And how have private on-demand companies worked with the public sector?
Well, it depends on what day you ask this question, on how many and what shared mobility offerings there are out there. Seems like every day there's a new option. I live in Denver, Colorado. I swear every single day there's a new scooter company that I see that I'm like, who are these guys? Or a bike. They're always parked out in front of my house. They're kind of obnoxious and red things, kind of sitting all over the place. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's really... So, I mean, if we're going through a list, I don't know how much time I have, but, you know, there is the Lyft, there is the Uber, you know, and I'd love to see, you know, see Lyft and Uber kind of getting into the more pooled services as well. I think that's a fantastic offering that you guys are doing. You know, the car share, the Zip car, via the Enterprise. Enterprise does, you can actually rent out those big vans and actually kind of create your own carpools to commuters. So there's a ton of different options out there. It's really just trying to tie them all together to make it a convenient trip, right? At the end of the day, if it's not as convenient as a vehicle, you're probably not going to take it unless it's an absolute necessity, right? I think, you know, if there's any young developers in the room, the holy grail of transportation is an application where everything can be integrated, from a Lyft to a Chariot to public transit to a scooter, and then you can pay all in one platform. I think that's the holy grail of transportation, and I know there's plenty of folks out there, but if you can be the first, it'd behoove yourself. If much smarter than me, I'm sure there's plenty of folks, maybe a young developer at Colorado State University that can start working on that post haste. But you know, that's really, I think, what it's going to take to really kind of break a lot of kind of the mass public transportation patterns. Right, habits are hard to break. But you know, with that kind of going to how public and private work together, that's one example, right? So one app where both a public entity, whether it be an RTD or a Transfort, and a Lyft and a Chariot, can all collect fees under one you know, streamlined app. And then you can also kind of time it out. You can see, okay, I'm going to hop on my Lyft to get to the transit, and then from transit, mass transit, Once I get dropped off by the bus or train, I'm going to hop in a chariot to Colorado State University, for example. All on one app, simple application, one payment. That is not going to be put together by the private or public sector. Simple enough. The public will not put that together. So that's where the private entities really need to kind of start working together. I get the question all the time saying, don't you compete with Lyft? Don't you compete with mass transit? No, we really compete with single occupancy vehicles. That's who our competition is. We complement each other. It's been, research has proven time and time again that more mobility options reduce the single occupancy vehicles and reduce congestion and so on and so forth. So it takes an army of options to really make it as convenient as a vehicle to get from A to B. Everyone loves complaining about traffic, but nobody loves taking public transit. And it's, they're hoping everyone else will take public transit. And so the roads will be free for me. Why can't these jerks, hop on the train and leave this road for me? So we all kind of have that common denominator style of thinking. So, one example that I always kind of love to pull is oftentimes with Chariot, we look at ways to crowdsource a lot of the mobility options, right? So we have a great client down in Austin, and one particular client that's, they were looking for better ways to get their employees to and from work. Down in Austin, just like around the rest of the country, they have terrible traffic problems. So they wanted to make that productive for their employees. But they decided, we love this community. We're a large part of this community. We want to pitch into this community. So they opened that up to the public. So even though they're sponsoring it, they're paying for the route, they've opened it up to the public. I think they charge $1 per ride, and it goes around the entire city. So you can literally circle the entire city of Austin for $1. And that's just some ways that we're looking at different options and ways to not only fund but also provide this to different cities, because oftentimes the regional transit agencies just can't handle the demand, and the roads can't handle the cars. So there's got to be some sort of kind of meeting in the middle. So there's a lot of ways. That's why I love being in this industry. It's really kind of exciting time because of this kind of renaissance that we're going through with EVs and AVs. There's a lot of ways. Once again, it's going to require that partnership and collaboration between public agencies, cities, municipalities, consultant agencies like these guys that can kind of put the plan together, really kind of take the 35,000-foot view, and then for the providers to fill in those gaps, and tons of data. So I think that's where there's a lot of synergies and required collaboration between both public and private.
Reducing the number of empty seats on the road. So many vehicles are traveling with no other seats occupied. So if we can all work together and really come up with a multimodal solution, I think that's really what will benefit us in the long term.
Let me start out with the question that in effect is, does traditional public transit have a future? And that's one that we hear more and more. And I'm sure, Chris, you're hearing that as well. And but I think that those of us who work in transit are pretty confident that it does. And Chris, in his comments, really touched on the reason why. It's always going to be much more efficient to carry more people in fewer vehicles than more people in more vehicles. And transit is really good at carrying lots of people in fewer vehicles. You can see that in the extreme in bigger cities like New York or San Francisco or Boston, where you can get well over 1,000 people in a commuter rail train or a rapid transit train. And that's a lot more efficient in terms of traffic or the environment and cost than it would be to carry them in 1,000 cars or 1,000 Lyft vehicles or 1,000 autonomous vehicles. So that just that fundamental geometry indicates that transit really does have a future, and for a lot of the same reasons that it's important today. So I mean, we're pretty confident that that's the case. A lot of people still do question that. I think the cost reason is also very, very important. Transit, although it's expensive, is an efficient way to carry people around. And if you look at Transfort, Max, which is a very successful service, that's a good local example of getting a lot of people into fewer vehicles. It costs less than $2 a passenger to carry somebody on Lyft. And if you compare that to some of the costs for, I think the lowest cost for Lyft and Uber usually is close to $8, the cost for a passenger, as opposed to the actual cost to provide the service. Microtransit is typically higher than that. So where we have the markets where we can fill up a big transit vehicle, it's a really good way to do things. And so I think when we talk tonight about alternative services, at least from the transit perspective, it's at the lower volume markets and not the places where you have your big services like MAX or other frequent routes. It's the places where there are transit needs, but you don't have enough people who can walk to a bus or get to a bus some other way to fill up a big vehicle. And in those cases, if you run a big bus to carry 2 or 3 people around, that's not a good way to do things, I think, for pretty obvious reasons. So some of these alternative services, whether it's a partnership with Lyft or doing something with microtransit in Chariot, if they can help deliver people to other services in a more cost-effective way than you do it with a big bus, that's a good thing. And those are places where, Mark said he sees it as more competing against automobiles. I think from transit, it's both. There is some competition out there, but there are lots of opportunities for the two services to complement each other, and that's what we try to focus on the most. And so if you look at it from a cost perspective, there are places where the costs start to converge. And for MAX, where it's less than $2 a person, there's no way that Lyft or Chariot can touch that cost. But Transfort's least productive route, the cost per passenger is up around $6. And in many parts of the country, it's even higher than that. So those are places where the costs start to converge and you can start to make more use of alternative services. And so while the cost may be higher than for the most effective traditional services, the convenience is often much greater. So you kind of got that trade-off between cost and convenience. So I think that the future is that there still will be fixed route transit. As I said, we're pretty confident of that. But the transit world is changing, and part of those changes in the transit world is that there will be more convergence between what these alternative providers are doing and what transit is doing, and more of a convergence in some markets, but not all.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff or Chris, can you, Mark talked about Austin. Are there other specific examples where the alternative services might have replaced fixed route that you know of?
There are a number of pilot studies going on across the country, and so this is what Jeff talked about is really where transit agencies have noted the gap, where there's a sort of a cross, an area where the cost to provide the flexible service is starting to be less than the cost to provide fixed route service, and that the convenience to the passenger, the customer service orientation, starts to get a far better proposition with the on-demand service. And so I could probably think of about a half a dozen cities in the country that are partnering, many of which there's an Easy Mile partnership out there, there's Lyft partnerships, there's Chariot partnerships, often with these types of private sector partners to basically provide alternatives to access the sort of the trunk transit network in low density areas or areas that just have really challenging terrain that are difficult to serve with traditional transit, or it's too far to walk or bike to get there.
There are a lot of pilot projects out there, and Brittany, you can probably talk about a lot that you have. The one thing to the best of my knowledge, they're all still pilot projects. Everybody's experimenting with a lot of different things, and a lot of the Uber and Lyft partnerships or pilots are looking at how to use Uber and Lyft as a first mile, last mile connection primarily, rather than to deliver you to a transit stop rather than to take you from where you're starting your trip to where you're going. So a lot of pilots out there. I think people are still trying to figure out how to make it work best. And again, to the best of my knowledge, none of those programs has yet been made permanent.
Lauren, the next question is for you. What role will autonomous vehicles play in the future of public transportation, and where are we already seeing this happen?
Okay, thank you. So you could literally write a book about this, but I will just say, so imagine, I'm going to kind of get theoretical for a second. Imagine like 20, 30 years from now, driverless vehicles exist, and you could literally have a personal driverless vehicle that will bring your kids to school, shuttle them around to soccer practice. When it's not doing that, it can go and pick up your groceries for you. It can go run and do a delivery for work while you're at work. Imagine all the different errands it could run for you and all the time savings you would have. It's pretty dreamy, and that's why people have gotten so excited about the autonomous technology, because in theory, it can do amazing things. And genuinely, car companies, pretty much every single car company is investing in autonomous technology, because the technology is here today, and it's going to continue to advance and get better, and we're going to see it more and more. And the potential is huge. But it's scary, that scenario of people sending those cars out and running errands, because if you think we have traffic today, imagine what it will be like then. It's actually really frightening. And it's to Mark's point, where I want to do that for me, and then everyone else, you should get in trains and buses so that we can have the clear roadways. But that's not going to happen. So it's really important for public transit agencies to have a role in this space and get ahead of it, because car companies are getting ahead of it. They are investing tons of money. GM just came out in the last 2 days saying that they're laying off, I think it was 10 or 15% of their workforce, but they're pushing all of their investment towards autonomous and electric technologies. So it is very serious. The car companies in particular, while they are going to still look to sell vehicles, they are also looking at shared services. So we're going to see a real mix in the business models there. But in the meantime, I think it's very important for public transit agencies to say, what are our goals? And how can we leverage this technology? How can we actually incorporate it into our services, whether that be acquiring their own fleet or doing public-private partnerships? But it's going to be important to say, what are our goals and what do we need to do to accomplish that? And today, working our way back to today, really figuring out what pilots we can put in place to understand that. And I'll give you a really good example. So Easy Mile has driverless shuttles operating literally all over the world. We have a huge demand, because there's a lot of interest both from public sector and private sector. So on the private sector side, we have interest in like community developments, airports, parking lots, circulators, college campuses, corporate campuses, things like that. But on the other side, there's a ton of interest from public agencies that are from the cities and public transit agencies wanting to understand how they can leverage the technology. And the exciting thing, from my perspective about what Easy Mile has, is that we're introducing the driverless technology in a shared and electric vehicle. So it's a 15-person driverless shuttle, and it creates an opportunity to introduce the driverless technology to the general public in a way that's not just a passenger car. Because if you read any headlines about the driverless technology, 99% of them are about the passenger car. So that's really what the association is today. And we as a tiny little company, and we have some other companies as well, are trying to break that mold, and that's important. So public transit agencies can start to incorporate that with pilots. And really quickly, an example, we're going to be launching a project in the next month with RTD in Denver. And the project is going to be a first and last mile connection from one of their rail stations to that area. And it's pretty short. It's going to be a couple miles long, and the shuttle is likely going to have low ridership to begin, but the purpose, and RTD has said this publicly, the purpose is not to generate lots of ridership. The purpose is to test the applicability and the reliability as part of the transit service. So it's a learning opportunity, and we think that's awesome. That's exactly where transit agencies can go to help both introduce and educate the public, but also introduce and educate it within the agency as well.
And one thing I wanted to add, I think from the public transit agency side, the benefit of autonomous vehicles is, I think, very attractive. Labor's an expensive part of operating a transit system. Doesn't mean that we're going to have buses with no attendants or whatnot on them in the future, but freeing up that capital to do other things, to be more customer oriented, there's a lot of potential there. So as Lauren mentioned, there's a lot of interest from the public transit side about the technology itself, and in sort of the industry wonky circles that Jeff and I hang out in, there's a fair bit of speculation that public transit buses will be one of the earlier sort of forms of fully functional autonomous vehicles, because they tend to be in maybe not fully autonomous, but often are in a little bit more controlled environments than cars running around through shopping centers, dodging shopping bags and kids running around. So it's that type of technology that might be there first. And if you've ever ridden, subway trains, there's a lot of autonomous electric vehicles already out there deployed in a rail setting that function day in, day out. Is how to get that into the rubber-tired version is the next wave, but it's not very far off, in my opinion.
Great, thank you, panelists. So, Brittany, how are rideshare or transportation network company services changing public transit, and how can they be complementary?
So our 2018 Economic Impact Report actually found that 26% of Lyft passengers in Denver use Lyft to connect to public transit. We've continued to work on building partnerships with transit agencies and cities across the country to drive more users onto public transit and reduce car ownership and single occupancy vehicles. We also actually see that 29% of users in Denver use Lyft to get around when public transit does not operate. So we're truly complementary to public transit. However, while rideshare is doing well, 86% of Americans still commute to work by their own car every day, and 76% are alone. Only 5% use public transit. Ride sharing is only a drop in the bucket, literally. Lyft and our competitor still only represent 1% of the miles driven. So our team is committed to working with transit agencies to create more convenient multimodal transportation networks with the goal of driving more users onto regional transit systems and ultimately achieve sizable reductions in single occupancy vehicle travel and car ownership. We realize that transportation doesn't just impact how we get from place to place, but shapes what those places look like and the lives of the people who live there. Ultimately, as excited as we are about transportation, we're equally excited about the impact ride sharing could have on reducing the space allocated to cars and repurposing that land to greener and more productive uses. We enjoy the process of collaboration with our city partners who conceive new ways to use the Lyft platform to improve access to transit and place people, not cars, at the center of our communities. Some examples of these collaborations, so the Rocky Mountain Institute and the City of Boulder have really encouraged us to pioneer using Lyft as a means to actually alleviate downtown parking congestion. The City of Santa Monica, we're actually doing a pilot with them that integrates the real-time transit options into the Lyft app. So this exposes more users to public transit options for each trip and encourages multimodal travel. We're actually also in discussions with RTD on a pilot program as well. So the final piece on that is part of our long-term commitment to sustainability. Lyft actually offsets carbon emissions from all rides, so 100% of Lyft rides are carbon neutral. We are committed to using shared rides, bikes, and scooters. So while these three options aren't available in Fort Collins, we've had shared rides in Denver since 2016, and we're a part of the pilot program for bikes and scooters, even though you're not super fan there. But these multimodal options do fill that first last mile gap, and while focusing on sustainable transportation. So we could work very well with the transit plans being discussed here tonight.
Next question goes back to Chris. Chris, where could the alternative services work in Fort Collins?
So that's a good question, but it's a bit of a loaded question because it depends on what your outcome is. UC Berkeley recently did a study where they provided some families chauffeur service to see, well, if you're, as Lauren was talking about, if everybody had a car that could do all sorts of things for them, run sorts of errands for them, what would the outcome be? So they literally had a chauffeur drive people around, and the result was people loved chauffeur services. They're great. They didn't have to pay for them. They love free chauffeur services. There was a lot of travel, but people got a lot of benefit out of it. So Alternative services, if it's from a very personal standpoint, would be great everywhere in Fort Collins because you could do all sorts of things. But as was discussed earlier, what are the consequences for everybody else if everybody's doing that? And so that's when I sort of frame this question a little bit differently, what is alternative services and where would they most likely work in Fort Collins from a sustainability viewpoint from the residents, from a public how much public funding do we want to put into these sorts of things, how much environmental impact do we want to have? It sort of helps to narrow back to, again, what we've talked a little bit here about before, is that alternative services under different forms work great in different parts of the city when they serve to sort of leverage the core transportation system that's already in place. So alternative services like a Easy Mile autonomous shuttle would be great as a first last mile connection or as a way to sort of run service at a lower cost on a lower demand route since it's a smaller vehicle. Partnerships in Chariot and Lyft can do very similar things. Other types of mobility services like scooters, shared scooters, and bikes, those can help connect people anywhere. Their footprint is much smaller, although I think we still need to figure out how to store them in an orderly fashion. They still provide a lot of connections that it might just be more convenient to hop on a bike or a scooter if you're able to do so, and make some short connections, even if you're downtown or near the campus or something to that effect. So this multitude of options, I think, works everywhere in the city, and there's going to be different types of modes that make the most sense in certain parts of the community. And again, balancing what do we all want to pay out of our pockets, either publicly or privately, to support that. So I think how this is all going to sort itself out is still being hashed out. That's why we're still seeing these pilot programs in place. But it's encouraging and it's exciting to see so many of them out there because those pilot programs will give us some data to help plan here in Fort Collins what are those mobility innovation zones going to look like, and what do mobility hubs mean for our plan. We're going to put our emphasis on what we think they mean as of 2018, but it's going to change over time. But needless to say, I think that they each have a bit of a fit in different parts of the community moving forward.
Let me add to that a little bit. I think that, I talked earlier about different types of transit services in different types of markets. I think one thing to understand is that no type of transit, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to transit. And also for the ways that people get to and from transit, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Different types of options work better or worse for different people based on their specific needs and their desires and other sorts of things. So I think that everything we're talking about, there is no one single thing that solves all the problems. So we have to look at, all of the different solutions that everybody here brings to the table, including scooters. And so it really is important to think about this as the solution is lots of different things rather than just one thing.
Yeah, just one thing to tag on. I think Mark said it. The holy grail is sort of better information all in one place. I have, and I'm not normal, I'll admit it, I have, I think, 8 or 9 different sort of like mobility apps on my phone that I can say, okay, what's the scooter option? What's the transit option? What's Lyft going to cost me? Each of them have their information, and it's great, but wouldn't it be nice if you said, hey, I'm going from point A to point B, and you could look up on your computer or on a smartphone a menu. What do you want? How quickly do you want to get there? How much do you want to pay? Those sorts of things. There's a whole sort of brand of research and work going on out there that's working on that. It's called Mobility as a Service. And some European cities are starting to pilot that idea that all the information is aggregated on one point and you pay through one point to access that. And I think, as Mark said, in the public sector here in the United States, that's a tall lift. I think a public-private partnership will get there in time, but that's where all these options really start to gel and give people a much more coherent choice about what to do, and people will not default to driving by themselves in their car anymore. They'll start to have some more thoughtful choices about how they want to get there and how much do they want to pay to do so.
Thank you. Okay, last question for Jeff. Jeff, what are ways that transit agencies have paid for expanded services, and are there strategies that could work in Fort Collins?
Well, that's the most difficult part of all of this, is to figure out how to pay for it. As I've already said, transit's expensive. Transit systems want to do a lot of things like provide more service and partner with folks like you. And the question is how to pay for it. Probably by far and away the most popular, most common, maybe I shouldn't say popular, is a local option sales tax. So that's driven probably the large majority of major transit expansion projects. I'm not sure whether that option is here. There's a limitless number of other ways to pay for transit, all of which involve raising revenue, usually through taxes and fees. And that ranges the gamut from surcharges on hotels to rental cars to excise taxes on cars. Or it includes, in some places, not all that commonly, but property taxes, also general funds. Whatever the city wants to do is going to cost money, and the best way to figure out how to pay for that is to do work to figure out what all of you are willing to pay, what those options are, and which ones are the most palatable to you. And so there is no one-size-fits-all solution like to any of this, but I think probably the simplest answer is the local option sales tax is the way it is most commonly done, but certainly not the only way.
Lauren?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, and I have a feeling my colleagues on either side will say the same thing, but at least for autonomous shuttle projects, we have so many stakeholders involved in one project. Whether it's led by the public or private sector that's driving it, you always are going to have, catch that pun, driving it, you are always going to have the city and the state involved, especially from a regulatory perspective. You end up getting, say the shuttle is going to serve a local hotel or an airport or any kind of the storefronts that are in that area. You end up with the local transit agency being involved. A lot of times local research institutions like to get involved, and those actually all end up becoming potential funding partners. So it actually creates a lot of opportunity to kind of spread the cost on all of it. And then the only other thing I would say is I think we would all agree that we, and Mark said this before, we do not see ourselves as competitors. We see ourselves as great mobility options that can really complement each other. And so that also creates opportunity for the public sector to say, okay, which is going to meet the best need there? And it's actually a great way to help to funnel those funding, the limited funding that is available, to say actually the most cost-effective way to do this here is with an autonomous shuttle, but elsewhere it could be Chariot, it could be Lyft, it could be a fixed route public transit bus. So it really will vary depending on what the goals are for that particular area, and then also what stakeholders are involved.
Yeah, one item I would add to that is if you do make it as simple as humanly possible, where people begin to stop purchasing cars, and I'm sure my parent company, Ford, would not be very happy with me. And to clean up an earlier point, they did just buy a scooter company, so now I'm in bed with them. So, but the average car, I read yesterday is costing about $9,000 a year when it comes to insurance, vehicle costs, fuel costs, so on and so forth. You start redirecting, and that's costing each one of us with a vehicle in the room $9,000 on average per year. You start eliminating your need or going now to a one vehicle family. That's when you kind of start getting a little bit more of the public, general public dollars saying, okay, well, it might cost me $10 to get there, but I don't have a car payment this month, So it's just kind of redirecting a lot of those funds if you make it easy enough. Once again, you have to make it easy enough and get the infrastructure and put the plans in place to really kind of direct that. But there is kind of that shift that eventually will happen, at least we believe, I would assume, that there will be more public dollars on that. But also, Chariot really believes in crowdsourcing, so a lot of the times we will, work with public and private to kind of crowdsource those funds as well as the riders themselves, but we want to keep those as low as possible to keep ridership levels up.
Yeah, just to add to that, 21% of users in Denver have pointed out that they rely on their car less because of Lyft. So that's just a fraction. So the more there's opportunities for multiple uses and multimodal transportation, that percentage can just increase.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, as I said, I'm from Boston, which is a super expensive city to live in, much more so than Denver. Most of our offices in downtown Boston, most of our staff is young, and most of them don't own cars, and that's one of the ways that they can afford to live in Boston, that plus roommates. But the ability to live their lives without owning a car is the difference between living a good, happy life in Boston and something a lot less. Yeah.
Great, thank you, panel. That wraps up the specific questions to the panel, and I think Timothy now is going to open it up, and we're going to put you guys to work again for a few minutes. So.
Yeah, this is the next handoff. I just wanted to add something to that last discussion. An oft-asked question of us at Transfort is, well, to pay for the system, why don't you just raise your fares, right? Simple way, get the users to pay for the system. And the reality at Transfort and the reality of any other public transportation agency is that fares make up a very small proportion of our operating budget. So at Transfort, we talk about $500,000. That's 10 to 15% of our service. Doesn't pay for a whole lot. Why don't you raise fares? What happens when you raise fares? Your ridership drops, right? So there's a direct correlation. Many studies have been shown. It's what they call highly elastic. And what happens, you raise fares, the ridership drops. So that's the trade-off. You could raise fares, but you're going to have typically lower ridership by raising the fares. So, I just thought I would mention that as we're talking about this subject. I've got a brief introduction or pause here to talk to get you to the next question. And this, I'm going to refer back to the map that we showed earlier. And I know this is a little bit confusing, so I'm going to just take a couple seconds to refresh yourself on what this shows. A lot of colors here, but focusing on the lines for a minute on this map. So the dark blue lines would be bus rapid transit. It's a lot of service. The lighter blue lines would be frequent service. The different colors, the pinks and the fuchsias, are basic service, 30, 60-minute service. Think about it in those concepts. And then the outer areas that are kind of hatched are that innovation zones, on demand, other kinds of services that we've already discussed. Okay, so keep that in your mind as we come to the next questions. These questions get harder and harder. No more easy questions for you. So you hit the hard ones already? Okay, well, it gets much harder. Okay, it is. And we're going to have a question on that in just a minute. So it does get harder than that. Okay, so a very confusing question, so I'm going to lead you through this a little bit. What is the right balance between fixed route? What we're talking about is buses, right? Operating on routes that you see today in Transfort in the city, and on-demand services, those alternative services that we discussed, microtransit, Lyft, and other kinds of things. And so your choices are a range. One is all bus, no public on-demand. This is how we operate today. There's no public on-demand, except paratransit. We won't talk about that tonight. That's alternative. Expand system with buses. So if we expanded the system with buses and on-demand, so do both of those things, expanding the system, and that's what we're showing in our preferred scenario. Do high-frequency buses on key corridors only. And then all other areas we fill in with on-demand. And then finally, replace most of our bus system with on-demand. So hopefully clear choices for you. Buses, no buses, basically. Okay, so, and this, I should say, the response we've heard really echoes what we heard during our planning process. People generally want more service, right, everywhere, okay? That's great. Okay, so that's sort of showing us what we're hearing. A little less so, more high-frequency buses on corridors, okay? Now, it gets harder. How often would you use public transit if the system were built as envisioned, the system that you saw or that you imagine in your mind, from the previous question? Daily, weekly, monthly, rarely, or never? This could be more buses, yes. Under the current preferred scenario, this would mean expanded service, looking at a few more BRT, bus rapid transit routes, a few more high-frequency routes, and some general expansions, right? I would say a moderate amount of growth in transit. Okay, so people generally said weekly. They'd write it less frequently than daily. Many of you said daily as well. Okay. These next two questions are, how much are you willing to pay for that system? So, and then here we're talking about the on-demand, we're talking about microtransit, Uber, Lyft, those sorts of things. Would you be willing to pay higher fares for on-demand service? Not the buses, just the on-demand, that special service that we're talking about. Okay, most of you said yes. A few would say maybe, depends. Okay. And then finally, okay, this one's a little confusing, so I'm going to walk you through this. And then we're talking about buses here and service in general. How much would you be willing to pay for expanded transit service? So remember, preferred scenario, what most of you selected was you want to see expanded network, expanded service, both buses and on-demand. So the first one is none. You don't want to pay for it. Okay, no expansion, right? That means no expansion. That means what we have today. Low, a little bit of money a month. Let's just say $5 a month. And I'm showing you what that would pay for. And this is in rough terms. So you get one bus rapid transit, and you get one frequent route, okay? So it's sort of generic, but to give you an idea of what that amount pays for. So medium, $10 a month, so $120 a year. Oh, and let me explain that we didn't specify how you're going to pay for it. Is it we're assuming some kind of tax, right? Sales tax, some other kind of tax possibly. So we're not specifying that here. Obviously, there's further work around that. Medium, $10 a month, $120 a year per household. You get 2 bus rapid transits. You get 2 frequent routes, approximately. Okay? And then finally, high, are you willing to pay $15 or more a month? And you get 3 bus rapid transits and 3 or more high-frequency service routes. And I'm not talking about some other services that could be added. These are the big ones, right? These are the high-cost items. Above and beyond, yeah, thank you. Above and beyond the current service. These are new things. That's the plus what we have today, max, and the service plus additional service. Thank you. Good question. Okay, so most of you said high. So you'd be willing to pay on the high end. So, and it's a few of you, a fewer amount would say medium. So we're talking about medium, high. That's sort of the range that most people feel comfortable with those levels. Okay, that's great information. This is a very high level, so we're just talking here. But this will be helpful for us to understand from you all. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so I think with that, we're going to go back to the panel. I'm going to have Ann come back up. And this is your opportunity to ask us those tough questions. Hopefully, you've had some time to think about some things you were wondering about. So
you've been very patient, and I can feel the energy. You're ready to just start with those questions.
My question is, how of your guys' panel for people with intellectual disabilities like me, how can you compete or make it more competitive for paratransit or any similar format of accessibility transportation to allow all those formats to be more accessible?
Yeah, I think equitable accessibility to transportation is at the forefront of our concerns. A lot of our vehicles, do have wheelchair accessibility. We also have different ways to book rides, whether that be through phone for visually impaired, through websites, as well through an app. So for the hearing impaired. So that type of and that is a great question, and thank you for that, because that is a top concern that I've been hearing across Denver, across all around the state of Colorado, and it's something that really needs to be looked at, not only with those with disabilities, but also the aging population. That population is the fastest growing group. The accessibility to healthcare is also something that can be difficult. not only, the door-through-door services, as they call it, where you can request a ride that the driver will get out and assist you into your wheelchair, out your door, into the hospital or into the care facility or what have you. So there's a lot of challenges on that. I'm not going to say that it's perfect as is, but I know that that's something that we are really concerned with and putting a lot of efforts in. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer as to what the future might look like on that, but working in the transportation industry and working with agencies like Transfort and CDOT, that is at the forefront of their minds right now. So I would ask you, I think, maybe to be patient, and I think a lot of those areas would ask you to be patient on that, but that is something that every transportation agency looks at and is concerned with.
I honestly totally agree. It's a really good question. It's something that is really important from Easy Mile's perspective. It's something that we are talking to all of our clients about, public and private sector. Our vehicle is what we call ADA friendly, so it isn't totally ADA compliant, but we expect it to be in the next few months. We're working on it. The other thing is that we're actually we're going to be starting to work with the university to do research around that, because ADA was created like decades ago, and there are things in there that doesn't even necessarily make sense for the autonomous technology. So we also want to be in a position not just to comply with what's there, but to advance those discussions. So we are looking at a few different use cases or projects where we can work, for example, in a retirement community, in partnership with the university to learn. So again, I will second Mark's comment. We do not have a perfect answer to that, but it is really important, and know that both on the private sector and the public sector, it's of the highest priority and really being tried to be figured out.
And I can add one really big opportunity is that, at least for paratransit services, is being able to use the on-demand reservation services that alternative providers can provide. I'm Timothy. I'm not all that up to date on how your paratransit works, but most paratransit, you've got to call and make a reservation 24 hours in advance, which is a really antiquated system. And transit systems by themselves can't provide that on-demand technology, but these guys all can, and that's something that can come, in the relatively short term.
One thing that autonomous technology presents as an opportunity, and I can't say we're totally there yet, but when we're at the point where we can completely remove the driving functionality from the operator role, you actually enable that position to be filled by someone that is actually more skilled and tailored to the needs of the ADA community. So the autonomous technology presents a lot of opportunity, whether it be in a paratransit vehicle or circulating around a retirement community or whatever that place is. So again, it's not all figured out, but I think there's a great opportunity there.
Stay tuned.
I don't know if you guys can, this is going to be a tough question, but I'm going to ask it. Has anyone ever thought about consolidating all the transit services through legislation, expanding RTD to the northern region, using economies of scales in terms of cost, fares, ridership, functionality, with local jurisdiction having a say through the board on RTD and merging, where we can use transit to go from north and south, east and west, from community to community, rail, bus, Lyft, and all the other integrations they have, because they've been at it longer. They seem to be very solid on it, what they're doing with the rail. And I'm sure people hit the floor, but sunset Transfort and take the savings from it and reinvesting it into our community and using RTD on a global scale, which would take legislative, but has anyone ever thought about this?
Well, I'll give it a shot to start with, and then I was just talking to Jeff about that, and what I was talking to Jeff about was that it is, this question, whenever we do these sorts of larger scale transit plans, comes up about what about a regional transit agency, and we get it goes both ways. We get, what should we divorce ourselves from the regional transit agency and sort of provide the service on our own, versus should we consolidate with or create a new regional transit agency? And the reason why we get these questions and why there is no uniform platform that you see out there is because it really varies based on the mix of the communities that they're trying to serve. The large transit agencies can have some economies of scale in terms of being able to purchase fleets, some of the training and some of the back end pieces, but they not always, but sometimes can have issues in sort of tailoring the local route structure to really meet the demands of the local community. They're trying to satisfy sometimes major transit flows between major employment centers, and some of the smaller, sort of less transit-rich communities don't often get a lot of attention paid when they're sort of doing their system planning. It's not universal, but that is often a complaint that we hear under those larger scale transit agencies. So it certainly gets looked at, and sort of the governance structure and the management of the transit agency, large or small, is very much important in terms of how well that system is run. So it's really, more on that front in terms of how well is your system run, be it large or small, I think is sort of key to providing good customer service. And where it's not working well, that's when people start to question, should we change things up? But again, it goes both ways in geographic scale.
And I'd really like to echo Chris's comments. I think whenever you have large agencies, the smaller communities, and especially outlying communities, which you would feel like they're not getting their fair shake, because there's more transit riders, there's more facilities in the core of the area. And so bigger systems generally focus our attention there. And I used to be the director of planning at the MBTA in Boston, which is one of those humongous agencies. And that was true. I mean, it wasn't because we sat down and decided Boston was more important than Framingham, and I use that as an example because it's split off. It was because if we had routes that had issues with over 20,000 people a day on them, which we did, and then there's a suburban route with 500 people on it, that got our attention, and we never had enough attention to pay. We never had enough time to pay enough attention to everything, and so that kind of unavoidably happened. And I think that's the real downside, and that you lose local control that most communities don't want to lose.
And just one thing to add to that, I think one area that I think, again, getting back to this sort of unified payment system, again, I have, I think, 6 different transit tap cards in my briefcase for the different agencies out there.
I have more.
I bet, yes, Jeff, we should like do dueling cards. It's, trying to get the systems unified such that you can seamlessly move and get information between those. That's a technology thing that I think certainly within the grasp. It's not easy in talking with agencies. It's not easy to do. And the private sector is rushing sort of to provide platforms that I think could make it a lot simpler for a public agency to glom onto. But that in and of itself would really help, I think, navigate so that if you have a tap card here in Loveland, you could go to San Francisco to use it. You could go down to Denver and use that. Wouldn't that be great? I think we'd all love that, because it's as long as they can figure that out, it would just be a way to make transit generally more accessible than it is now.
Clearly, the voters in the last election said they don't want to pay for road improvements and transportation in Colorado. But, when I look at that, and there's multi-billion-dollar discussions going on, it seems to be road-centric. It's about cars. And, they're like closets. The bigger closet you have, the more stuff you're going to put in it. The more roads you have, or the wider, the more cars you're going to have on them. Can you speak to examples of other states or cities that have really shifted culturally, to go to a more public transport concept, because we can't keep building roads. We're not going to keep building our roads out of this situation.
Oh, Jeff and Chris work nationwide, so if you want to take a stab at that initially. You guys get all the tough questions.
I think Denver is one of the best examples in the country right now. We do work all over the country, and other cities want to catch up with Denver. Denver has developed a light rail system in less than 20 years, which in transit years transit time is very, very fast. 20 years ago, Denver didn't have much of a transit system. And now it's got one that, yeah, you can say that there are lots of things wrong with it, like you can with any of them, but they've done really well. Other cities that have done really well lately have been Seattle, which has been expanding service very, very quickly, and like Fort Collins is one of the few systems in the country where transit ridership is actually going up a lot. Expansion, projects that we were working, we've been working in a lot of cities that are planning expansion. Las Vegas is one right now, and Las Vegas is one of those cities that explicitly would like to catch up to Denver. We did, one of the projects I worked on was Kansas City streetcar. They were also looking to, they felt like they used to be peers with Denver and no longer are, and want to catch up, and expanding transit is one of the ways to do that.
I'll just give one more. It's more of an international parallel, so it's got some issues with it. But if you go to Canada versus the United States, if you look at the transit performance between the two areas and you take any sort of two peer cities together, it's quite different, and that has to do with, again, very different structures there, but just different choices that were made over the years in terms of how to pay for transportation infrastructure and how much fuel taxes go to roads versus transit, and how much fuel taxes there are in general, more fuel taxes in Canada. But if you go to Calgary, for example, it looks like a lot of US cities. It's a lot of single-family homes, got a downtown area, but their transit ridership is much higher, and you can kind of look at other, like Saskatoon, why would that be a big transit mecca? But compared to a lot of US cities that would be otherwise comparable, it is. And it's really those choices. So your fundamental philosophy is generally correct, that with different choices you get different outcomes. But I think it's got a lot more, cities are making that choice more at the local level here in the U.S. versus the federal level, which is a big difference in the Canadian example. But that just sort of shows that, yes, if cities choose to make that choice over time, it takes time, people will start to change their patterns. But again, it's to each their own city to make those choices here in the U.S. And some places don't want to do that, and some places have voted themselves additional taxes to specifically invest in a different type of transportation system.
So I used to be a consultant, so that's what qualifies my answer. So one piece of it is having really good transportation and mobility options, so investing in public transit. The other piece of it, though, is land use. I mean, Timothy started his whole presentation showing the land and the density in the different places. So one piece of it is the policies that are in place. It used to be that there was a really big focus to have a minimum amount of parking for every real estate development that went into place. Now there's a trend towards having a maximum number of parking spaces for all new developments. So there are policy rulings that can actually influence, you can require car sharing spaces instead of actual full-time parking spaces. You can limit the amount of density or growth that happens in a city. You can stop investing in more roadways because it's 100% proven the more roadways there are, the more cars there will be that fills them. So it's two sides. And the other piece of it is incentivizing. So there are examples around the world where they've added congestion pricing. So you can actually charge people when they drive into a city in a single occupancy vehicle. When they drive within a cordoned zone, they pay more. And you'd be amazed how many people find alternative uses and alternative ways to get around when they have to pay more. But that being said, that money can then get put towards public transit. So the people that are paying more to use the single occupancy vehicle can then be funding better public transit for those people that are not choosing to use the single occupancy vehicle. So these all kind of work together, land use, the incentive tools, the policy mechanisms. These are all kind of the levers that can be pulled from the city perspective.
Hi, I'm Mindy Cooper, and I'm a family leader from the Family Leadership Training Institute of the state of Colorado. My question is, when you are looking at a transit system, do you also take into consideration people with invisible disabilities also? And I participated in a study probably 20 years ago about doing a train from Denver up to northern Colorado. Is there anything going on with that?
I can only speak to Chariot's, accessibility. Like I mentioned in this gentleman's comment earlier, we do have a phone-in system for any visually impaired individual. We also, for any hearing disability individual, we have visual applications. So that is our way to be. We're fully ADA compliant, so that is something once again at the forefront of our mind. In regards to the train aspect, I know that RTD does not have any plans, at least that they've told me. I don't work for them, but that's no surprise. I think your best bet there might be Elon Musk. He has actually looked at Denver, if you don't mind going about 700 miles an hour. Unfortunately, nothing that I know of. Maybe these guys, maybe they're talking with
Chris?
And Ann, you might be more up on this than I think it's a CDOT, I think it was a CDOT study that was kicking around, but I don't know of anything specific.
Chris, I can answer that question. So there was a study. It was done a few years ago, updated a few years ago with the cost, but there is a study out there to look at the feasibility of a commuter rail from Denver to Fort Collins. That study is still out there. It's still valid. Obviously, there's a funding question around the cost. It's multiple billions of dollars to pay for that system. But just so you know that there is a study out there that looked at a commuter rail between Denver and Fort Collins.
I know that there is a way you can get to Denver by bus, and that is to take our Transfort out to the Harmony Transfer Center and pick up Mustang, and that'll take you to downtown Denver.
So, Melina, we have a live Facebook question. Is that correct?
Correct. So speaking of technology, we are Facebook Live, and one of the questions that came in is how will autonomous vehicles help the city address its climate goals, part one. And part two, would expanding bus rapid transit be more effective to reduce emissions?
Lauren, would you start with that one?
Sure. So first and foremost, one cannot assume that an autonomous vehicle is electric. Those are two entirely separate technologies. That being said, most of them that are being developed today are being built on electric vehicles. So fundamentally, we are going to see a massive improvement towards our climate goals, because as long as the autonomous technology is built on an electric vehicle, that's amazing. That being said, we are not doing good things if we add to the congestion on our roadways and we build out more roadways to accommodate the congestion. So it's going back to that question of how much of these autonomous vehicles are shared. That will greatly influence how well it supports our climate goals.
And I'll just answer the last part of it. Expanding BRT, as long as you can fill up the buses, would certainly be more environmentally friendly than putting people in lots of vehicles. And BRT, just like autonomous shuttles or any other form of microtransit, that will also be in the future autonomous, and the same forms of propulsion that you can use for a small vehicle you'll be able to use for large vehicles.
Hi, my name's John. Thank you all for being here today. A question specifically for Lauren and Easy Mile. Autonomous technology is pretty cool. I'm excited about it, but once the novelty wears off, I think you've just got an electric shuttle without a driver. So the primary advantage there I see is the labor cost. So this is kind of a two-part question. What part of a transportation budget is typically just driver labor? And am I missing any other advantages other than just the labor cost on Easy Mile? Thanks.
That is an awesome question. Feel free to validate for me. I think that we've seen numbers like 60% of an operating cost. It's good.
For operators, yeah.
Is just for operators. So it's pretty significant when it comes to the cost savings. So that is the first thing. In terms of other benefits, so first of all, the cost savings is huge, just to highlight why that's important. I mean, you're already seeing there's so much of a greater need for public transit than there is funding. So anything that we can do to increase the amount of public transit service is going to be good for the environment. It's going to be good for congestion, for livability, for mobility not just for all of us, but also people that maybe are really mobility challenged, like disabled and elderly communities and that kind of thing. So So the cost thing, while it sounds so basic to just focus on numbers, it has very significant ramifications. Other than that, though, I think the other option that we're seeing, and this is going beyond the autonomous technology, but we're starting to see more and more public transit agencies do what we call right-sizing the vehicles, so using different capacity vehicle types, and then also moving more, trying a variety between fixed route and on-demand. So the autonomous technology combined with a lot of other technologies make all of these things more options. It's just creating more options, and it's allowing us to put the best service in place for what is required in different locations, because as you saw from your land use map, you're serving a lot of different people that are going in a lot of different directions. So the better options and the best you can tailor the services, the better off we'll be for getting more people into public transit. And I think autonomous combined with all these other disruptive technologies creates that opportunity.
And can I ask people a question?
Well,
so
yes.
how many of you have ridden on autonomous transit? Can you raise your hand if you have? Okay. So that's a lot, so you may know the trick to this question. And then, so how many of you have flown in and out of DIA? So, and if you've flown in and out of DIA, you've ridden autonomous transit. And that shows the question about the novelty wearing off. There's probably no novelty at all to riding that train at DIA. But that's an example of how autonomous transit is already here, and you often don't even realize it. So.
Okay, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Okay. It's a current question that we're asking ourselves at the city, and that is, should we wait to invest in additional public transportation? Should we wait for these new technologies to come on board? Is it more cost-effective? Should we delay decisions about purchasing new vehicles, expanding the service, and save that for later when we have these technologies that will become more efficient?
Okay, so we get asked that question all the time by public transit agencies in particular. And I'm going to go back to the mayor's point about the parking garage before I answer your question about fleet. There are cities across the country, around the world, that are having to make decisions. They have parking needs today, but they know 20 years from now they may not have those same needs. And I would say the number one thing for public agencies to do is build flexibility into it. Build a parking garage that maybe costs a little bit more, but has the ability to be converted into a storefront and a residential, just has that variety and flexibility. Yeah, so that's the first thing. So when it comes to fleet, it's the same thing. So as much as you can build fleet that have the ability to be automated later on, if you're not ready for it today, or that have the flexibility, maybe you do more leasing options. I mean, look at your procurement processes to support that. Really think through a way to say, hey, we know what we need in the next couple of years, but we don't even know what options will be available in the future. And then the other thing I would say is get those pilots going now, because you have 3 really innovative technologies available right now, and there are others as well. And there's a lot that can be learned today that will help you later on. I mean, the navigation that needs to happen from your procurement process alone to get into these 3 areas is probably in itself a learning experience. And then you have things like insurance, educating your public, the list goes on, navigating the regulations. These are all things that it's not going to get any easier. There's no reason to delay it, and if anything, it's going to put you behind if you have to do it all later on. And the other question is, what are you waiting for? Timothy, I'm not picking on you. but you don't. When is the right time to pull the trigger? So it becomes actually a really hard question.
And one thing too, that there are providers out there that don't require upfront investments of the capital. You don't have to buy your own shuttles, or buses or things like that. So there are different providers and options out there that don't require that huge capital or upfront capital investment as well.
Is that an offer, Mark? I'm just going to.
I've just heard. I'm not. I'll have to Google it.
So we have a follow-up response on the question about commuter rail, and I'm going to call the mayor back up, and he has some answers for us.
Right. So in 2017, the state legislature on the Senate side approved a bill that was funded. It was Senate Bill 153, Southwest Chief and Front Range Passenger Rail Commission. So it formed a commission and then put money into that. I believe it was about $2.5 million a year, but it actually gets to getting to some framework that gets to some operational future as it relates to the development, to facilitate the development and operation of front range passenger rail system that provides passenger rail in and along I-25 corridor. So there is some action on that front.
Thank you. And I hope you're clapping for yourselves because this has been a great dialogue. My question is for you, did you find this event valuable? Can I see a show of hands who found this discussion valuable? I certainly did. I learned a lot. I did want to, before I conclude, I want to acknowledge one key individual that made this happen, and that is Seth Lorson. He happens to be out of the room right now. Seth is in the back. He helped make this event happen. So I'd like you to give a big round of applause for Seth. Seth, thank you. And then to conclude, I just want to say that I think what I learned specifically is that public agencies like the city really have an important role in terms of changing mobility. So as we talk about shifting or adapting or accommodating or facilitating or making happen, shared mobility, that's going to be our role in the future. So that's my take home, and I hope we can explore this further in our transit master planning process. I also hope that you continue to be engaged in that process. I hope you go to the website, you continue the dialogue, you get signed up. So again, I strongly encourage you to do that. And again, thank you so much for attending. Have a safe night, ride the bus, and come back and engage with us further. Thank you.